Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Battle of the Somme 1916 by Epic History. Now recently I reacted to Epic History's series on the First World War, and near the end of that series I was informed they did this episode specifically on the Somme, so we get a deeper dive on one of the conflict's most famous battles. Now before we get into this one, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below and will give you access to exclusive reaction videos. Now with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. Alright, Battle of the Somme. It's a big one.
1916. Europe is in the grips of the most destructive conflict yet known. World War I. Much of the fiercest fighting takes place on the Western Front, where British, French, and German armies are locked in a bloody stalemate.
Much of the fiercest fighting, much of the bloodiest fighting, also much of the most stagnant fighting, right? A lot of killing, a lot of death to move a battle line, not very much, right? It remains quite stagnant. Just to situate ourselves, we're in 1916. You know, we're about halfway through the conflict. The conflict is sort of set into place, right? The two sides are pretty well cemented. Of course, we've still got a while to go, but we're sort of fully into the swing of things, into trench warfare, and we're seeing some of the biggest battles of the conflict, particularly in this case, right, the Battle of the Somme. And of course, we're dealing with the Western Front in this video. There's a whole lot more to see, but we talked a lot about that during our reaction to Epic History series on the conflict. Today, we'll get to focus in a little bit.
On 450 miles of trenches. There have been millions of casualties, but neither side can break the deadlock. The combination of barbed wire, machine guns, and heavy artillery means troops trying to cross no man's land, the open ground between the trenches, are slaughtered en masse. The advantage is always with the defender. But the Allies are committed to more attacks. They're determined to liberate the parts of France and Belgium that were occupied by Germany in the first months of the war.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that initial assault by Germany, sort of heading through Belgium, taking territory in France, and then we sort of sink into this stalemate. And now, for years, we're sort of in a similar position. After those initial gains, things really slow down, at least on the Western Front. You know, we'll see a lot more movement in the East.
The British and French have agreed to launch a joint offensive in the summer of 1916. But the Germans strike first. In February, they launch a massive assault on the French fortress city of Verdun.
One of the other most famous battles of the conflict, of course.
Its defense requires all available French reserves. So the summer offensive will be led by the British, their biggest attack of the war so far. Its chief aim now, to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun.
The big push.
The attack will take place along a 25-mile front near the River Somme in July. The new British commander, General Sir Douglas Haig, would prefer to attack near Ypres, where there are clearer strategic objectives. But the Somme is where the British and French armies meet, so where a joint offensive must take place. He would also prefer to wait until his inexperienced divisions have received more training.
We're seeing a couple of interesting things here. One is the British and the French, the Entente powers, trying to work together. Now, during, say, World War II, the next World War, we do see more of a joint unified command structure, right? Where the Allies, though not working perfectly in sync, are working more as one force. Whereas here, you know, some sort of issues emerge. We are seeing them work together, but it is sort of a struggle at times. And we also have this point about the relatively inexperienced army here, right? You've had a lot of people signing up, a lot of volunteers, particularly early in the conflict. We're in 1916 at this point. A lot of the initial enthusiasm has died out, but not all of it, right? We have a lot of volunteers, a lot of people coming in who are relatively inexperienced, at least in the British Army. They're enthusiastic. Some of them still are. They may be well trained, well prepared, but may be inexperienced, which can obviously cause problems in a battle such as this. You can train only so much for combat, and that is absolutely important. But there's a reason why veterans are so important when you're fighting a battle, right? Because experience, it matters.
But the French need his help now.
Yeah, the French are getting battered. Not to say it's one-sided, right? Not that the Germans are absolutely destroying them, but this is a bloody, bloody conflict with the Germans and the French, and of course the Brits, everybody involved. But I'm just saying, the French and the Germans are really going at each other. The French are taking a real beating. It's time for Britain to step up. Even if they don't feel entirely ready, it's time to go.
The Somme has so far been a quiet sector, allowing the Germans to build up strong defensive positions. Here the Germans have two formidable defensive lines, with a third under construction. Each consists of 3 lines of trenches: fire, support, and reserve, connected by communication trenches.
Right.
They bristle with machine gun positions.
And this is what you see developing throughout the conflict, right? There's the initial race to the sea, where everyone's building trenches, sort of in a race to see who can build them the fastest and cement their position. But now those positions have been stagnant, even now, for a while, and so you start to see more defensive lines, more trenches built to interconnect the trenches, right? There are these networks of defensive lines, trenches, and it's very sort of complex functioning system in order to fight this war.
And are anchored on fortified villages and strongpoints. In front of the trenches, there are thick belts of barbed wire. Below are dugouts, some 10 meters deep, to shelter German troops from artillery fire. Telephone lines buried 6 feet deep allow troops at the front to communicate with artillery batteries during an attack. The German troops that hold...
It's just one of the examples of how new technology is playing a role in this conflict. I mean, there are so many examples you could talk about, and we did during the series, but we're seeing one important one here, right? It's not all about sort of military technology, weaponry, I guess. You also have a lot of communication technology, the ability to travel, move a lot of men relatively quickly. There's some important innovations here.
Artillery batteries during an attack. The German troops that hold the line are well trained, and most are combat veterans.
Yeah. Important. They know we're coming, all right. Okay.
The offensive will be led by the British Fourth Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Henry Rawlinson. With Haig, he draws up the plan of attack. To overcome the Germans' formidable defences, the British will carry out a massive, week-long artillery bombardment with 1,400 guns. This is expected to destroy German barbed wire, flatten trenches, and kill their occupants.
Right, the artillery here, along with, of course, killing Germans, is also, probably more importantly, flatten the barbed wire, flatten defenses, basically open up so the British troops can make that move forward, right? That's a big role that artillery is playing in this conflict. You're continually shelling enemy defenses, once again, yes, for the purpose of killing people, but also for the purpose of destroying those defenses.
Flatten trenches and kill their occupants.
Such a defensive conflict.
19 mines are also dug under key German strongpoints and filled with explosive, ready to detonate just before the attack begins. To the north, the British Third Army will make a diversionary attack at Gommecourt. The 16 British and French infantry divisions are then expected to take their objectives with minimal opposition. The attack will begin at 7:30 a.m.
And I just want to go back to that map for a second. I talked about sort of the joint offensives and the two forces working together, but about how it was not as unified as during the Second World War. And we can see here, this is technically a joint offensive between the Brits and the French, but this is overwhelmingly a British-run offensive, right? They're sort of running the show. It's, mostly them, with some French, of course, an important part of the battle, but it's primarily British. Sort of like, Verdun is a primarily French affair, right? Once again, not to say there was not any working together from these forces, but we're seeing here how that sometimes looked in practice.
Position. The attack will begin at 7:30 a.m. in broad daylight, so the artillery can observe its fire. British morale is high, and the men are confident of victory. Many of the units taking part are PALS battalions, the eager recruits of 1914, now about to face combat for the first time.
Right, so like I said, you might think, oh, well, we're 2 years into the conflict, we're pretty deep in. Sure, and that is true, right? However, you still have a lot of these battalions that were these eager early recruits and have not seen much, if any, combat yet, right? This will be their first exposure, still inexperienced, still relatively enthusiastic. Now, you've got a lot of troops, Brits, but also especially German and French, they've been in the trenches, literally, and metaphorically is more what I mean. They've been fighting. They're now experienced, and enthusiasm is dying down, right? But you do still have some of these troops who are really getting in there for the first time.
But on the eve of the assault, there are worrying reports that the British bombardment has been only partially successful.
Uh-oh.
1.6 million shells are fired. But due to inexperienced gun crews, a shortage of heavy guns, and faulty shells, much of the German barbed wire remains intact.
Oh.
German defenders, too, are largely unscathed in their deep dugouts. And from captured prisoners and listening in on uncoded telephone calls, the Germans know exactly when and where the British are coming.
Okay, so they're ready for it. 1st of July, 1916.
The Allied artillery bombardment reaches its peak at 7 a.m. At 7:20, the British detonate an enormous mine under a German strongpoint, the Hawthorne Redoubt, and British troops rush forward to occupy the crater.
All right.
At 7:28, further mines are detonated under German strongpoints along the front. At 7:30, the Allied bombardment moves on to the German second line, as British and French infantry begin their advance across no man's land. German troops, meanwhile, race up from their dugouts to set up machine guns.
Yeah, a lot of the advancement, at least on the Western front, comes in situations like this. You've bombarded the enemy position for days, if not weeks, or a week, and you decide now is your time to advance. And so you crawl out from your own trench, march yourself across no man's land, getting gunned down as you go, and try to take the enemy position. Extremely violent, bloody. This is, talking about World War I, you hear a lot of sort of analogies, comparisons about you're essentially feeding men into a meat grinder. This is when it really feels most like that, right? When you're sending men across that no man's land, and they're just getting gunned down as they go.
It's an enduring myth that all the British infantry climb out of their trenches and walk steadily towards the German line. A few units do, but most send men out into no man's land before the bombardment lifts. So the final dash toward the enemy line is as short as possible.
Yeah.
But in the northern sector, whichever tactics are used, the British are easy targets for German machine gunners, especially where they bunch up to get through the few gaps in the barbed wire.
Right, like I said, it's not like they were, or what it is they were trying to optimize, so they spent as little time as possible out there exposed in no man's land. That doesn't change the fact that you're still feeding those men into a meat grinder. They're exposed as they cross, especially when bunching up, even if they're trying to pick opportune times and trying to go quickly, and a lot of them are going to get gunned down. It's just a fact of the situation.
The British infantry advance bravely, but are mown down in their hundreds. Some units do break into the German line. Near Thiepval, the 36th Ulster Division captures the Schwaben redoubt. But without support on either flank, it's isolated, and the survivors are forced to retreat that night. On their right, the 32nd Division takes the Leipzig redoubt. While near...
We're talking about such a large-scale conflict, with such a large-scale battle here, that, as we're seeing, you can't just have some of your men advance. You need a successful advance from a large chunk of your line so they can secure their position. And we're talking about large numbers of men here. And so you have a lot of situations where there's sort of partial advance, but it doesn't necessarily work entirely because it's such a defensive conflict. You're not going to break through everywhere, and it's relatively easy to sort of push you back.
La Boisselle, the 34th Division captures the Lochnagar mine crater. But these are just small toeholds in the German line, far short of their objectives.
The fog of war.
In World War I, one of the greatest challenges faced by commanders is getting accurate information about the course of the battle. Reliable field radios haven't been invented yet. Telephone lines are regularly cut by shell fire.
Yeah, you can imagine how unreliable telephone lines would be in that situation. Right? You're dealing with a lot of imperfect information. And plus, like I just mentioned, the battle is of such large scale that there's so much information you need to get to be able to have an accurate rendition of the battlefield, and you're not getting all that information, or frankly, even close to all that information.
So officers must turn to messengers, flag signals, light signals, even homing pigeons, none of which is completely reliable. To get around this problem, during an attack, supporting artillery works to a fixed timetable, moving their fire onto the next line of enemy defences at a set time. So when the infantry start their attack, gunners adjust their fire onto the second line of enemy defences. But if the infantry get held up, the supporting fire keeps moving on according to the timetable.
Right.
The infantry get left behind and are at the mercy of enemy machine guns.
Right, you've got a battle plan that doesn't always necessarily accord with reality. Right? You've got this plan, you've got this schedule, but as we know, plans, especially in battle, almost never play out exactly as you have envisioned, and sometimes they play out nowhere close to what you have envisioned. Right? Particularly in a conflict like this, where you can look at a lot of these different battles, advances, offensives, and you'll see that almost all the time, the goal that's stated, the advance they want to make, they almost never get even nearly that far. So it's not incredibly surprising that the infantry isn't moving as quickly or as far as you would have hoped when you were setting your artillery schedule. And as they're pointing out, that creates some serious issues. Now they're missing that supporting fire when and where they need it most.
Aerial observation by balloons and aircraft can provide valuable information, but rely on good weather and control of the skies.
Right.
This is why, on the 1st of July, it takes British commanders hours, even days, to find out which attacks have been successful and which have failed. This makes it extremely difficult for them to react to the situation.
Yeah, you've got all this modern technology, right? Weapons, transportation, communication, but it turns out a modern battle comes with modern problems. You've got all this new tech that lets you communicate in the way that you never could before, right? Of course, communication during battle has been an issue throughout the entirety of history. It's been one of those things that has always been a problem, particularly in larger scale battles. Well, we've got some technology that can solve that problem. Fantastic. Well, we're dealing with some new issues here, though. Right? We're dealing with truly horrible visibility. We're dealing with these massive scale battles. We can't get information back, right? We can cut phone lines, right? There's a whole lot of issues. We have contested control of the sky. Weather can put us off. There's all these things, all these issues that come that can negate the impacts of these modern innovations. Or it turns out that some of your modern weaponry will also impact the effect of your modern technology, communication, travel.
With any speed.
Gains in the south.
Further south, there is much greater success. Despite heavy losses, the 21st and 7th Divisions take Mametz and cut off the heavily defended village of Fricourt, which the Germans abandon overnight. On their right, the 18th and 30th Divisions take their objectives, including the village of Montauban, which is secure by 11 a.m. Alongside them, the veteran French 20th Corps also takes its first day objectives, as well as 2,500 German prisoners.
Yeah, so you could imagine there's some commentary here in regard to the battle about the sort of relatively inexperienced British forces versus the more experienced French forces, right? And maybe that experience really plays a role. I think that's probably the case, though I'm sure you'd have to dig a lot deeper into the battle to sort of disentangle the different reasons for why the battle goes the way it does. And even then, you can never truly break it down. But, it is the case that there is a sort of relative lack of experience among a lot, though not all, of these British forces, right? And we do see a sort of advance here in the south. But of course, there's just those differences that you face at different points along the battlefield as well.
The Germans didn't expect the offensive to extend so far south and are less well prepared.
Right, so that's another factor that you can add in.
And crucially, the Allied bombardment is boosted by French heavy guns, which are much more effective at destroying barbed wire and German strongpoints. At 9:30 a.m., French colonial troops lead the attack south of the Somme River. The French seize all their objectives and take 3,000 more prisoners.
Yeah.
Despite success in the south, the first day of the Battle of the Somme is a costly failure for the British. German losses for the day are estimated at 12,000 men. The French lose 7,000. But the British suffer a staggering 57,000 casualties.
Yeah.
1/3 of them killed.
Jesus. I mean, there's a reason why this battle is one of the best known of the conflict. Its scale, in terms of how many people were involved, but also the scale of death, particularly for the British. Right? We see the Germans and the French, of course, they take high casualties, but the British, both due to their inexperience, the fact that they are advancing, right, down the majority of the battle line, right, they're running most of it. It's mostly British troops on the side of the Entente, and they're advancing, right, they disproportionately, for those reasons, take the most amount of casualties. And you can see it's very disproportionate.
The 1st of July, 1916, becomes the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. And it's just the first day in a battle that rages for another 4 months, finally ending in November amid freezing rain and mud.
Yeah.
By then, the Allies have advanced 10 miles at a cost of 430,000 British casualties, 200,000 French casualties, and 450,000 German.
And these are the kind of trade-offs we see in the First World War, which is once again why there's a lot of talk of throwing men into a meat grinder. You see these relatively short advances, which are taken at the cost of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of casualties.
It makes the Battle of the Somme one of the bloodiest in history.
Yeah.
In British popular memory, the Somme is remembered as an unmitigated disaster and tragedy, evidence of the incompetence of British generals.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of commentary about the First World War, both during and afterwards, as would be expected. And, typically the big battles of the conflict are not seen as sort of heroic victories or, heroic instances of battle, but they're seen as tragedies, right? Where the men involved are more victims than heroes. That's sort of the narrative that we have about World War One. This very costly conflict that wasn't necessarily fought for, any good reason, you could say. I wouldn't say it was fought. There were reasons why it was fought, but no good reason to sacrifice that many people. So it's seen as this very costly tragedy. There's the sort of narrative that's associated with it, and the sort of military leadership of the conflict does not get a very good reputation. Now, it's more nuanced in reality, right? Not every general of the First World War was someone throwing all his men into the meat grinder, like, yeah, just sacrifice all of them. But there was definitely some of that, right? Especially in some of these big battles. And that is really what's remembered and is sort of disgusting to people, generally.
And the pointless sacrifice of the gallant soldiers under their command. But to those who fought it, and those at home, the Battle of the Somme was seen as a success. Casualties were enormous and hard to bear, but across Europe every warring nation was suffering terrible losses, as all commanders struggled to find an answer to trench warfare.
Yeah.
And at the Somme, the British had not only helped save their French ally, who went on to defeat the Germans at Verdun, but learned vital lessons about how to fight on the Western Front. Most of all, the Battle of the Somme had been a costly but necessary wearing down of the German army, an immensely painful but vital step on the long road to victory.
I mean, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. It is certain that it was extremely costly. That's a fact.
Maps and research
Alrighty.
for this video come from
So that is the Battle of the Somme, 1916 by Epic History. We got to dig into one of the specific and most famous battles of the First World War. Like I said, I recently reacted to their series on that conflict. If you're interested, I have it linked down below in the description and in the comment section, so you can go and check that out. It was definitely interesting to get some more detail. It's sort of, I don't want to say more of the same, but I guess you could put it's a good way to illustrate a lot of the themes about the First World War in this one battle that we see repeated throughout a lot of the different battles of the conflict, right? You do see some common themes, particularly if you're talking about the Western Front, that you can sort of pin down and analyze as you go from battle to battle. And the Battle of the Somme is a good place to point that out. It really is good as a lot of the other battles. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed this one, please leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, linked down below. With all that, hope you guys are having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.